Forward as well. So thank you for being here and for joining in for this topic. So this is our eighth in a series of 12 webinars, really all focusing on the Building Strong Foundations effort to support early childhood mental health. Today we're going to be talking about developmental differences, understanding early signs, and considering neurodiversity, temperament, and developmental variation when we're thinking about mental health for young kids. So this won't be a talk specifically about what the milestones are or that. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but really in the context of understanding children's behavioral and mental health presentations. How do we consider development and neurodiversity and temperament there? Just a reminder that we are recording this, as Haley said just a minute ago, for folks that have been, called away to other tasks, but intended to delve into this content, and happy to do so. And just thank you to Haley and Randy and the whole team at the Mental Health and Recovery Board of Union County for supporting this webinar series. It's been a treat to get to do with all of you. As I said, this is part of a larger series. We're now on the second visual page here, number 8, developmental differences. And then we'll get together in June, July, and August to round out the series. So we're talking about relationships in early care settings, a little bit about observation and assessment when we're considering infant and early childhood mental health informed interventions, early language and social development and how that contributes to children's presentation and success in different settings, and then closing out with regulation in early childhood. So we're getting through all these topics. I think you all know me by now, but just to sort of properly introduce myself to you all, my name is Kate Sweeney. I'm a clinical social worker by training and have focused all of my career post-master's degree in the field of infant and early childhood mental health. So I've done that work within a number of different academic settings to support children within communities, within early Head Start, within primary care, and then have since moving into the UConn School of Social Work, gotten to partner with teams like yours to really apply these best practices and evidence-informed interventions to support young kids and families within sort of systems and grants. So it's been a treat to get to call that my job. Our goal for today, so as I said, really considering developmental differences, understanding, practices and conversations in just the context of development, developmental variation, neurodiversity, and temperament when we're considering early childhood mental health in terms of families and programs in front of us. And I'll read to you out loud just the objectives on the right. So by the end of this hour, wanting you all to sort of really have a handle on sort of defining neurodiversity, temperament, and developmental variation within early childhood, having some concept of early signs of developmental differences, and considering, as we said, sort of autism and also sensory processing differences. Having a handle on describing how temperament and neurodevelopment influence behavior, communication, and relationships, and then how do we apply that to our intervention? So really sort of thinking about practices that are considering and supporting a range of temperaments and neurodevelopment, and the communication and behavior that comes with that varied approach within our work. So that's the goal for the next little bit of time together. Going to start with these 2 review slides, as we always do, to kind of ground us in the infant and early childhood mental health principles, knowing that this work is really focused on relationships, that development happens within the context of family, culture, community, opportunity, etc., and that we always want to sort of evaluate where kids are and what's needed, but also come to this with a strengths based and prevention focused approach. So you're gonna, try to think about the strengths in sort of a given presentation or approach or condition or diagnosis. And, like anything within anything early childhood, the idea of prevention focus, meaning, not waiting until something gets gets bad or clinical, but how do we come and sort of offer interventions, knowing that is the most impactful, both for children themselves, for the workforce that's supporting them, and for their families. And this is the second sort of review or grounding slide. This is considered our sort of national definition of infant and early childhood mental health as the developing capacity between birth and age 5. Some would say even a little bit longer now, to form and develop close relationships, to experience, tolerate, and express a range of emotions without lasting collapse, and to explore the environment and learn from it. So thinking about this as, borrowing from the slide before it around strengths-based and prevention-focused, the definition around mental health for infants and early childhood is not about deficits. It's not about, needs or diagnoses, but really sort of what does positive mental health in that age range look like? Wanted to invite you all as we're talking about this topic, and I would imagine that early childhood developmental sort of milestones and contexts are something that many of you might know a great deal about, and some of you might feel sort of less aware of. It's something that I think generally, the public knows, the general public, parents, families, etc., knows a lot of sort of the sort of big physical milestones. We know when we expect kids to sort of sit up generally, or take first steps, say first words, etc. But how do we think about this? Not so much in sort of a checklist type way like that, but to spend this hour kind of thinking about how are we being inclusive and supportive, and seeing the variation of need within a given setting, based on sort of context of development. So with that in mind, I wanted to invite you to just hold this reflective prompt in mind. So think of a child whose way of experiencing the world challenged or expanded your understanding of development. What helped you connect with them? So if anything comes to mind, inviting folks to share in the chat, or go off mute and share with colleagues. And the child doesn't have to be under 5, because we start with the context of development in early childhood, but of course that carries over. So does anyone have a child or person that you interacted with that comes to mind with that prompt, whose way of experiencing the world challenged or expanded your understanding of development, and what helped you connect with them?
Hello. Hi.
Hi.
Hi. I'm Chris. Hello, everyone.
Hey, Chris. Share.
I do have a few children in a family, including one of them is my child. What makes me connect to them is the need to understand the world and how it functions.
Thank you.
I think that is the biggest thing I do have with my nephews and my child. Like, how can I understand your world? How can I make it better for you? And that makes me closer to them. It builds a stronger connection for me.
I so appreciate you just jumping in and sharing that, and also just the emphasis that you put on understanding your world. And so much, I think we've done a good job in sort of having some of this shift in our global approach to this in the last 10 years or so. I think it used to be a lot of like, how do I make you fit my world or the world, versus what you're saying now, Chris, which is like, how do I understand your world or your perspective, and what's needed to support you to be successful or content.
Thank you. It is how I understand their world, because my world is already understood.
Yeah.
I already fit in normal norms and social norms.
Yeah. I just want to acknowledge that Jess gave you a heart and Melissa gave you a thumbs up in response to that.
Thank you.
Thank you for jumping in. Anybody else have thoughts in response to either what Chris was saying or the reflective prompt? Okay, well, thanks again, Chris.
Thank you.
Going back to sharing screen. Okay. So why this matters, right? And actually, I think, Chris, you just gave it such a great context that so much of what we're responding to when we think about behavior or mental health for young kids is sort of their behavioral response. But if we kind of hold in mind so many different things with respect to how do we understand not how to terminate the behavior, but what the behavior is communicating, what caused it, what's needed instead, it helps us to better meet that child's needs, right? So rather than just terminating the tantrum, how do we understand what they're reacting to and why? And within the context of, a child that's under 5 or 6 years old, understanding behavior, understanding where they are within a neurodiversity spectrum, et cetera, becomes such an important part of that. So I'm going to play a video for you here. It's old, but the brain architecture is old as well. And so it's a video out of University of Minnesota that still does a really great job of talking about what we understand within brain architecture and how that contributes to child's development and the interplay between child's brain and sort of their biological growth internally and their relationships and environment. So I will stop and let them tell you themselves.
Our brains allow us to perceive and interact with the world around us. This 3-pound mass of tissue contains nearly 40 billion neurons and 100 trillion synapses or connections, sending information to the rest of our body at a rate of nearly 500 messages per second. Science tells us that early brain development affects the course of our later lives. Years of accumulated research on how the brain develops and functions now informs best practices in the nurturing of children. But there remains a disconnect between this science and what is practiced in communities. The gap between knowledge and practice has huge consequences for society.
If we look at the cost of health care, the achievement gap, look at crime, the problems that we face in society today, science tells us that we actually know the root of these problems. Many of these problems actually go back to early childhood.
I get a lot of referrals from school for behavioral problems. A lot of times teachers refer kids due to acting out behaviors, attentional problems, learning problems. Although we call them school-related behaviors, lots of times they've developed years and years before. They just start showing when children enter school.
We all know that some children get to school much more capable of learning than others, and that how they arrive at school will influence how they do for the rest of their academic careers. So one way to think about the development of brain architecture in early childhood is it's a lot like building a house.
And as when building a house, the developing brain requires a sturdy foundation. A proper brain foundation needs responsive and nurturing adults.
Our brains definitely need stimulation to be able to wire the brain up correctly. Left in a crib, a child cannot provide the stimulation its brain needs to form a healthy and solid brain architecture.
Responsive parenting is key to a process called pruning. Pruning is how the brain creates the most efficient pathways possible. During the first year of life, there are periods of growth where nearly 700 synapses are formed a second, creating connections for language, hearing, vision, and movement. However, not all these connections are needed or are efficient. Pruning back the pathways that are rarely used allows the brain to send signals more quickly. These pathways are the foundation for later learning, forming our brain architecture. Babies' brains grow by building themselves from the bottom up.
So you're sculpting the brain by the information that the brain is processing.
By the age of 2, our brains have already made some giant developmental leaps. Regions of the brain that control vision and hearing have already developed. Areas that handle language and communication skills, which are heavily dependent upon interaction with adults, are rapidly developing. And the part of our brain that deals with higher-order reasoning and cognitive functions is at its crucial beginning phase of development. Sadly, many children do not receive the attention they need to form healthy brain architecture.
By age 2, we can already predict third-grade reading scores. So many of the things that we think are happening later in life are actually have their beginnings in early childhood and infancy.
The ability to predict third-grade reading skills at age 2 has to do with understanding brain architecture. The part of the brain that controls language and communication has its largest growth spurt during a child's first 4 years. Without a responsive adult at this age, the pruning process begins to disconnect underused pathways. This leads to language and reading difficulties later.
The brain doesn't work in pieces. It works as a coherent whole. So if the foundation isn't set well, it sends poor information to those higher centers. And what starts looking like a problem in this part of the brain ends up being a problem in attention regulation and in higher order cognition. So brain architecture is not set by 2 years of age. There's still a lot happening. But what happens early influences what happens later. Skill begets skill.
Research shows that children who have had positive adult interaction, adequate nutrition, and minimal exposure to stress arrive at school better able to learn than those who have grown up with those factors. What adults can do to help a child's developing brain reach its full potential will be covered in the video Serve and Return.
Any key takeaways or sort of things that surprised you about that video or what they cover? So in many ways, a lot of the brain science of the sort of early 2000s and before helped legitimize a lot of this early childhood work that seemed like more like play or sort of fluffy prior to that. But it's such a, the period, the first 5 years of life and even 2 or 4 years of life, and some of the quotes from that video are just so influential and are unmatched in any other period of a life's trajectory in terms of the rate of growth and development. See something in the chat here about how early they can gauge reading levels. Yeah. And again, like those things are not set. Like there's intervention, but there are certain periods when the brain is just so primed. It's a reason why, 2-year-olds can learn language so quickly, and why I had a really hard time deciding to take Spanish after grad school in DC when I was offered 1 night a week. People can learn language then, but the sort of resources and effort and sort of concentration is just so different. Okay, so I will continue on, but just wanted to give folks opportunity to respond to that. And I'm seeing one more comment in the chat as well. Surprised by the pruning process, specifically rarely used, wondering how we can support parents to provide support for wiring the brain in best circumstances. New parents, first-time parents, may not have the serve and return habits. They often don't. And I think so much of what we can do, this was sort of a point I wanted to make in one of the earlier slides, but you said it so well here, Diana. A lot of these things, we know because we've sort of gotten into fields or into work where, this specific information is relevant or sought out. But a lot of sort of the general sort of guidance or knowledge around early development and how to sort of nurture that and support that and scaffold it as best we can is really unknown to parents. And the number of times that you hear families say things like, well, over or underestimate the impact of sort of reading to my child or talking to my child and sort of general routine activities and how much that really supports that brain growth. So any opportunities to kind of help parents feel like that is effective or this is impactful is really meaningful for sure. This is just another visualization of that. So you can see the demarcation is when most kids enter, formal school, right? So between 4 and 5 years of age, depending on if they're in, public pre-K or kindergarten. Some kids, depending on when they're born within the calendar year and the opportunity within their local system, aren't even entering formal school until like they're, 5.5, right? And so that's when a lot of sort of this general intervention or supports around these things are, but that the brain is primed to do, most sensitive or most primed to do these things. You can see sort of the general peak. So emotional control, if anybody's hung out with 1 or 2-year-old, that they're really working on that a lot. That's why, they call it the terrible 2s or the tantruming 3s, right? And that's the natural sort of skill, but so much that is really dependent on your environment, the simulation, the responsiveness that you get. Things like habitual ways of responding. So sleep patterns, those types of things are often seen in that green line. Hearing, understanding. So the language is the yellow. Peer social skills, we have a little bit more time, but again, all of these things are really, so important for scaffolding and environmental considerations in those early years. Yeah. Okay. And then this is just another sort of final sort of visualization of what she was saying in the video of the brain works collectively, but is really built from the bottom up and the inside out. So that these sort of areas where we're thinking about sort of the physiological state. So blood pressure, heart rate, respiration, body temperature, digestion, sort of those are all sort of physiological things that are happening in the brain stem and midbrain. And that any of our skills that we sort of consider these things to sort of on board more sort of later in development are dependent on the sort of regulation and stability of the foundation of the brain. So with that in mind, sort of understanding that, there's a ton going on. There's a lot of either opportunity or missed opportunities around sort of supporting children to sort of take on those tasks and skills before pruning happens. Wanting to think a little bit now about sort of understanding developmental differences within kids and knowing that developmental variation should be sort of considered and allowable and sort of part of what we're factoring in, so that, when we think about these sort of general milestones of, sitting by 6 months, et cetera, walking by 1 year, 1 word by 1 year, 2 word sentences by 2 years, et cetera. Those are averages, right? In, our sort of normed society. And many of those things are dependent on opportunity, right? If you look at some of the sort of developmental screeners or interviews, a lot of those tasks around, are they holding a pencil in a certain way? Are they sort of drawing a complete circle? At 4, are they drawing a human and you can sort of tell that there's legs and arms or whatever it might be? Those are all dependent on, it's not that at 4, when they're interacting with a paper and a pencil for the first time, they're able to draw that, right? It's all of the sort of scaffolding and sort of task accomplishment that happens between 2, 3, and 4, as they're learning to grasp things and learning to turn things with puzzles that sort of contributes to those skills happening. Even things like there have been studies that tie babies that crawl on their hands and knees versus some of the babies that sort of skip crawling or sort of have different sort of ways of crawling, and the impact on handwriting later on, right? So like the idea that, the sort of proprioception and sort of skill building that you're sort of navigating within hands as you're doing that sort of, using them for crawling and sort of those tasks, comes into play later on with handwriting, which I thought was fascinating. And the body is just so interesting, right? But this idea that like, if we think about it within that linear trajectory, there should also be a lot of variation for what we're seeing kids present with, and a lot of variation for, considering neurodiversity, right? That neurodiversity is actually a very beautiful thing, and it helps our society create things like art and music and sort of all types of things, and science and all those things. But how are we sort of allowing for variance there? We'll talk in a couple of slides about temperament and how we understand that, and how just like helping families and sort of first-time parents or sort of new parents understand like some of the developmental sort of considerations in general, helping them understand like how to delineate the temperament of their child and their own, can be really impactful. That we need to offer, opportunity for individual pathways for development. We know that there's some things that are really important or key, but, that humans are not equations. And so there's always sort of, other sort of parts of their own pathway that we need to consider. And the importance of really, understanding developmental differences versus sort of delays or deficits, right? That development is very interrelated, but not always linear. And sometimes we'll even take a step back, or we'll see developmental regression in a couple of areas. And that can be biological, or it can be, an indication that there's sort of other things to consider as well. And that culture and context matter so much for how we are observing and assessing and considering the development of a child. So a couple of just sort of considerations as we're building on this topic. So child development is holistic, right? With growth occurring simultaneously across 5 sort of key areas, and those are outlined for you here. So when we think about development, I think the most sort of obvious, right, is physical, because it's the most visible. I didn't mean to rhyme, but it did. But like when you look at child, you can generally, get a sense compared to peers of sort of, how old they may or may not be. And we have sort of a lot more, again, sort of public awareness, because it is so visible, of expectations of both gross and fine motor skills at different ages. Cognitive development is another domain of developmental consideration, and that's looking at problem solving, learning, sort of all of the sort of academic. But when we think about cognitive, we think about academic first, right? But there's so many things as I read this list, right? So problem solving, learning, understanding cause and effect, and memory, that have to do not just with academic skill or, the ability to read or write or sort of do a task within a classroom, but have to do with interactions within a family or with peers, right? The task of understanding cause and effect, of having memory, of problem solving, contribute a lot to social skills for sure. The next domain of development is linguistic. So both receptive, meaning their understanding of language, and expressive. So how are they expressing language? And in general, what we know about typically developing kids is that the receptive abilities with respect to language come on board a lot quicker, a lot sooner than the expressive. So socio-emotional or social emotional domains of development, again, we're seeing here their ability to form attachments, to understand and regulate emotions, and interact with others. Those are all other person dependent. So nothing within that domain will happen on their own. And then adaptive development. So these are what we think of sort of as later skills, but you'll see this often in some of the checklists as well for young kids, their ability to put their shoes on, get their coat on. So like their activities of daily living, as they're called within this field. And how are they able to sort of go from that being the trajectory of that being sort of very adult led to led by them. So within early childhood development, it's shaped by a complex interplay. So like we were thinking about, those different domains, but that any trajectory of any skill within any one of those domains is shaped by, as you can see here, a complex interplay of genetic, environmental, and experiential factors, right? So a couple of the questions on some of the surveys around development are like, do they use scissors properly by age 5? That all, again, has to do with their ability to not only do that task or sort of interpret the instructions for scissors, but have seen scissors, have access to scissors, right? And so a lot of this, again, is so the interplay here is so specific, and wanting to think about, the factors that shape development to include relationships. If I've said it once, I haven't said it enough, right? But that's such a key in sort of any component of infant and early childhood mental health, to think about their own health and nutrition, right? So access to adequate nutrients, routine healthcare, safe physical environments that, not only interplays with their capacity to do any of the things that would help them acquire the next phase of development, be it cognitive or physical, but their ability to sustain that, or an indication that there's a concern in any of those one areas. Their access to early educational spaces and interactions. So high quality early childhood education and care programs are often key factors. And you'll see kids when they enter high quality group-based care, you'll see jumps in their development because they're in environments where there's more peers, they're, being exposed to more language, they're also maybe outside of a home routine where like things, they didn't have the same opportunity to explore the environment because things were sort of taken care of for them by, a very well-intended caregiver. But when they're then in their environment alone, and it's an example of sort of the outcome of positive stress, right? It could be sort of stressful to their system to, yes, navigate that, separation and new tasks and needing to sort of fend for themselves a bit with respect to sort of a task or a toy, but they also develop more skills from that. Genetics come into play, and then environment and socioeconomics. So again, just what they're exposed to, their opportunities, the level of stress within a family, within themselves, all come into play and contribute to sort of how we're seeing development be demonstrated by young kids. And again, wanting to think as well, I just want to attend to the chat to make sure nothing is missed. Using simple sign language for prompting them to ask for things, letting them gain independence helps tremendously with, oh, that's great. He had language issues early on and is now 24. Melissa, thank you for sharing that. The baby sign language is such a great thing. And again, one of those things that, I think is a great illustration of something that can be used as an intervention if a child is, showing some delays with language or needing some more supports around language, but also something that like every child is really benefited from, and partially because it makes an interaction so much more relational, right? So if my son, who is now 4, but when he was younger would say like, "Mom, milk," right? I could easily understand the word milk, get his cup handed to him, and not have a lot of interaction in that demand, right? But if there's, oh, you want more, so the baby sign language for more is the, hands together, and I'm probably not using the right language for it, but all of your fingers together with your thumbs against them, and then you sort of tap them together in front of you, or all done is finished or all done, it makes sort of a task of a feeding task or sort of a response to a request task much more interactive, because you're using different visual stimuli, you're having eye contact at least for a bit of time as you're doing that. So it can be really great to use. Thanks for putting that in the chat. Okay, so now on to the task of the slide. I put this in here with the idea, again, not to sort of give you a lecture on cognitive development, but just to give you a sense. So Jean Piaget is somebody that many of you may have studied or sort of read about within, basic human development or like early psychology classes in undergrad or in high school, but is generally somebody who has done a lot of work to support our understanding of how kids develop. Like many in the field early on, Piaget and others, Erik Erikson is another one, they studied their own kids first, right? And sort of noted, common tasks and abilities and contributions to where they were developmentally from that to give us some guidance. Not wanting to give a whole lecture on cognitive development, but just to sort of have this in mind when we're thinking about social tasks. And really the point being made on this slide that we can think about cognitive development as, again, very academic or cognitive, but so much of this has to do with behavior and like how we're considering this. So as I read these out loud, just asking you to think about how this would show up in a child's behavior, and that they, might be labeled at or responded to in a negative way. So during the sensory motor stage of cognitive development, so between birth and 2 years old, humans are essentially limited to perceiving the world on a purely sensory level. This is why, so many things around sort of soothing or, things that babies sort of suck or sort of have sensory relief from are vital for this age. When an adult makes a funny face at you, laugh at what you see, dangles a toy in front of you, you reach for it, right? So you're being very responsive to the sensory stimuli in front of you. At the next developmental stage or phase between 2 and 6 years old is the pre-operational stage. So during that time, a child is beginning to incorporate language into their analysis of people and surroundings. However, in most cases, logical functioning isn't quite there yet. So a child might have trouble putting it all together. And this is often where kids, are sort of drawing connections between similarities and differences, and sort of trying to make sense of their world. Concrete operational stage is sort of the early elementary school and through elementary school age of 7 to 11 years old. This is before a child generally hits puberty, where he or she can process events and information at face value, but will still generally not be able to accommodate abstract or hypothetical thoughts. So a lot of sort of skill is being built here around sort of peer navigation. How do you predict or sort of change your interactions based on either something in the abstract or something hypothetical in front of you? And then formal operational stage, starting at age 12, but then going really for the rest of our tasks in life. That's when we're considered able to perform intricate mental gymnastics that make human beings, interact well, right? So thinking in the abstract, envisioning and planning for different scenarios, forming different strategies to navigate those, and understanding different viewpoints on something. So you can see all of those things are things that are applied in the cognitive, but really contribute to our interaction with other human beings. A little bit now, taking it back to the early years around just sort of screening for development, and just wanting to make sure that you all have the, the awareness of just some general screening tools, regardless of sort of what your role is with families. And all this is pulled from both the NIH and the American Academy of Pediatrics. That in general, developmental screening plays a really key role within identifying and being, again, more sort of promotional, preventative, or sort of early intervention supportive if needed when kids are younger, so that they can catch up and or stay on track as best as possible. So in general, we think about developmental screening as something that should be done universally and not targeted, because when we just target things, we apply bias and we miss things there. So the general guidance is that there should be formal general developmental screening, so full body screenings, at the regular well child visits at 9, 18, 24, or 30 months of age. There's usually an autism specific screening, the MCHAT, done at both 18 and 24 months of age. And the recommendation and sort of insurance approvals are for those to happen universally, and then ongoing surveillance. We often hear from family that they'll ask about different sort of delays or concerns, and the stance on either referring early or waiting and sort of seeing if kids grow out of it varies very much based on pediatric practice or sort of a given provider. But in general, I think we've become much more oriented around the need to sort of not delay assessment for intervention as much, knowing that a screening is just a screening. It's not a diagnosis or a qualifier, but it could indicate the need for more. The other thing that sort of general routine screenings within either child educational or health settings does is it also gives parents information around, so what should a typical 24-month-old be doing at this age, or 30-month-old? So those sort of checklists become informational for the providers if something is needed to be supported or intervened differently, and also very informational and sort of predictory to families. I will say that pediatricians are asked to do so many things within a well child visit that is often typically 15 to 20 minutes. So some of this sort of does feel often very sped up, and so it's helpful often for these things to happen in other settings as well. So if a family's receiving home visiting services, or if they are in an educational setting, it's often really helpful for the screenings to happen there as well. And just to give you some language around typical screening tools at this age. So the ASQ3, meaning the third version or third edition, is a quick, it's supposed to take between 10 and 15 minutes for a family member to sort of fill out. Looks at the 5 different domains. So communication, gross motor, fine motor, problem solving, and personal social skills, and is given by age. It's also available in a bunch of different languages. And again, sort of very informative for families as well. It also comes with a guide, like if a child screens as concerning in a particular area, it should be fairly easy for whether it's a child care center or a health center to be able to sort of give them guidance based on the packet that comes with the screeners, sort of, where, what some, interventions at home could be to support that domain. If it's like a, concerning but not clinical level. The PEDS is another very commonly used screener. So that's the Parents Evaluation of Developmental Status. It's a little bit longer, but all of these are sort of evidence-based and sort of supported by those within the health fields, and looks at, it's very dependent on like a family citing something as concerning. So something, things can be skipped if a family doesn't know to be concerned about it. So I'll say that with that caveat. And then the MCHAT, or the Modified Checklist for Autism for Toddlers, the recommendations are that that's done, again, I think it was at 18 and 30 months universally, just to be a baseline screener for autism or neurodiversity concerns. So that being sort of a primer on like general or sort of global development and developmental delays, wanted to think also about how things like temperament can come into play within developmental variation. So temperament is something that can be sort of seen as akin to sort of personality. So it's considered to come on board from the beginning. It's a way of us within the sort of developmental and mental health fields to kind of understand the activity level, the adaptability, the sensitivity, persistence, and intensity of reactions in a child, and to sort of categorize them so that the child could be understood. In general, all environments and activities should be, available and sort of inclusive of a range of temperaments, but often the sort of more agreeable, sort of lower activity, more adaptable kids that are less sensitive and less reactive are the ones that are perceived as tolerating the tasks of society in general better, right? So there are, kids that can wait for a really, really long time at the doctor and sort of not have a tantrum. There are kids that can tolerate, a range of noise levels within an early learning classroom and not sort of be sort of distracted by them, right? And then there are kids that are more sensitive or more reactive to those. So that's sort of a very sort of high level definition of temperament. There is, and I'll put this in the chat when I'm not sharing slides, but Georgetown has developed a tool that is really nice. It's actually two tools because it's one for infants and one for toddlers that helps parents or family members understand, based on a series of questions, the temperament of their own child. The other thing that it does really well is it helps them understand their own temperament and like how that sort of fits or not, and helps them plan things. And so a key example is like, if a child is highly reactive and sort of needs a lot of sort of sensory output opportunity, how do we plan a couple of activities ahead so that if we're going to be asking them to sit for a long time at the dinner table at a restaurant or wait with you at the doctor's office, they have the opportunity to kind of release some of that energy prior to that, right? So it really helps families like understand temperament a bit and help with some like concrete ways to plan around that. And when you see a lot of conflict, you see when like there's distinct differences between a parent's temperament and a child's. So the parent that feels really overwhelmed or reactive themselves to a lot of touch or stimuli, and the child that needs a lot of sort of support physically, that can be conflict. The more that you have sort of both the understanding around that and then the language and strategies around that, it can help both that parent and child to be successful. And this is a brief video that goes into that a little bit more.
So temperament refers to the inborn characteristics that each person has in their personality. There's no good or bad temperament, right? When it comes to temperament, there are many forms that you should be able to see in your child. So that could come to activity level, their sensitivity, how they react to new situations. These are all temperaments that you will be able to see in people and your child.
So slow to adjust children need extra time to adapt and adjust, to play, to new situations, to new people. Feisty, active children need calm, supportive adults to prevent stressors when possible, to prepare the environment so the child can be successful, and to plan ahead for things that might be hard for the child. Easygoing children may need support to find their voice and express their feelings and needs with others. But all children need to be heard, seen, soothed, safe, and secure.
Instead, we can help children learn ways to manage these emotions and feelings by focusing on their strengths.
Both children and adults that might be attending a program or being out in the community have information about what they can expect when they arrive. And for us to give choices to children, adults that are there to validate and hear a child's needs, to use visuals in our environments to support a child's understanding, to use the environment as a third teacher, to provide extra time and flexibility for individual needs. We want to listen. We want to pick up on the cues that a child is presenting with and to be in relationship with that child.
Children are learning their role in their family, in their community, in the world, and they're doing that by exploring different new experiences. So they're learning that their voice matters, that there's a consequence to their actions, and it could be positive or negative. For instance, when they make a silly face and they realize that their friends laugh versus when they knock over their friends' towers and they cry. They realize that there's consequences to their actions. They also realize their likes and their dislikes. And it could be preferences to food. It could be preferences to what they like to play and spend their time interacting with and who they like to interact with. But it really comes down to finding appropriate choices that we can give them.
So yeah, one of the things that we have to help parents understand and realize is that not always are children going to be happy. Part of their temperament, their personality, their character is that they're going to have times when they're going to complain about things. They're going to push limits. They're not going to be happy, especially if they're tired or hungry. It's even worse. So we have to remember that they're going to have those moments that developmentally it's fairly normal. And yes, we still have to deal with it. It doesn't mean that there's necessarily anything hugely wrong. It's just part of who they are in that moment. And sometimes we have to sort of deal with that in different ways and not panic that there's something else horribly wrong going on, but just temperament and personality and character.
And also, just to add to that, when we try and push our kids out of their emotions, they feel less supported and they're more likely to stay in that state for longer. If, as an adult, you're upset and you share with a friend that you're upset and they're trying to push you to get over it and be happy, you're not going to feel any better. If anything, you're going to feel worse and you're going to stay in that emotion longer. And so when you feel like you have the support and the connection from someone you love, then you're able to come out of that emotion faster and go back to your baseline, whatever that looks like. So being able to be with them in that emotion and be okay with all the emotions that children and, well, all of us experience.
Curious compassion is the way through.
Any takeaways? I'm just watching the chat as well. Any takeaways from that video? I think again, just the paradigm shift, right? Of like when there's conflict between a child's temperament and the task or the environment or the setting, and they might, erupt with a tantrum or crying or clinginess or whatever their sort of reaction is, to not like stop at wanting to terminate that response, but what is the root of the response? How do we understand what's needed? And if we were able to think about it in that way, so much of us wouldn't be scolding the response, right? But it would be, how do I help you navigate or tolerate, this environment that feels hard for you in this moment or whatever it might be. Because for the kids that tend to be sort of more sensitive or more reactive, because there is that level of temperament for some. We can't take away the task of being in a group-based learning environment, right? Or whatever it might be, or kids that are sort of more sensory, responsive, like that's going to be the environment. We can help them sort of plan or tolerate it. We can help them sort of practice. We can help them with sort of some self-calm or sort of some cues for when they need to break before it spills over. So much of this is how do we, help families and educators and others kind of understand the child that's in front of them, and plan accordingly, and not sort of lose our lid when their lid is off as well.
May I say something?
Yeah.
I believe also it's like how the caregiver or the professional um not knowing what is going on with the child and
Mm-hmm.
does not know how to regulate because
Yes.
it is, as someone that been through that goes through, it is extremely frustrating because it's not your world. It's a world that you're trying to be part of it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you you know, you don't have the academics, put it that way, to understand the level of need.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
sometimes that can be, I've seen that not only with me, but with other families, that can be extremely difficult in the environment, not only for the child, but also for everyone else in the family as grandparents,
For
everyone.
sure.
They don't know what to do, and it does
Yeah.
overcome. And I've
Yeah.
seen that people that will scream, that will punish.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
But,
you're absolutely right.
yeah, but
They'll
I
punish.
mean,
They'll also. It becomes a thing where it's a behavior that you're like sort of fearful of, but also watching for because you're trying to sort of expect. You come to expect it, right? And then yeah, absolutely. I think the power of sort of adjusting the adult response is so valuable.
it is,
Um,
but that's when you know what to expect. Like nowadays, I know what to expect, but there was a time that I had no understanding because my my child was diagnosed with autism as a teenager.
oh wow, yeah.
So, yes, so I always knew it was not something like on the average with her,
Mm-hmm.
but I always told them something is not quite, you know, in the social norms.
Yeah.
But I only was heard now, but for so long I was trying to like literally, what's wrong with you?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Not
Yeah.
being educated, not knowing, you know, how to get to that point where you need to regulate yourself or trying to regulate
Mm-hmm.
yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
education, it is actually a key for it. Um,
Absolutely.
and that's
Absolutely.
why I am trying to learn this so I can actually teach my brother who has
Yeah.
zero education and two children and different
Mm-hmm.
levels of autism.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah. I mean,
a lot for
the
him.
need for family education and family support and all that is so high for sure. Thank
It
you for
is,
sharing your experience.
yeah, it is. It's like it's a lot. I'm non-professional, you know, but I do see the need that people do need the information like desperately. Like
Yeah.
they're thirsty, like desperately needs help. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you for being here and for sharing personally. Yeah. And I know we're at time, we're at 1 o'clock and we've lost a couple people for that. So I'm happy to share slides and as Courtney said earlier, share the recording. I will just, for the sake of those of you that are on, I will put in the link in the chat, the link to the temperament tool that I had referenced. And that's a really great place to start. Um, Here we go. So as I said, there's one for infants and toddlers, and there's one for preschoolers. But a really great way to, again, just give families an understanding of is this a slow to warm child, and again, how do we not, as you were saying, Chris, like punish them for their response, but understand what they need to be successful in an environment. So thank you all so much for hanging on, and I look forward to next time.